They worshipped goddesses in their temples, painted women into the stars, and carved their names into stone. But if you were a real woman in ancient Egypt, none of that divine glory belonged to you. You weren't a goddess. You were a girl born into silence, a wife traded for livestock, a mother judged by the number of sons she bore. History might dress Egypt in gold and mystery, but behind the pyramids and painted walls, life for the average woman was anything but sacred. It was hard, it was quiet, and it was never really hers. In ancient Egypt, your entire fate could be sealed the moment you were born. And if you were born a girl, congratulations. Your life just got a lot more complicated. Before you could speak or crawl, your role in society was already pre-written. You were expected to serve, submit, and survive. While Egyptian civilization is often praised for its relative sophistication and supposed progressive views, especially when compared to other ancient societies, the truth is, being a woman still came with a whole list of limitations and expectations that made life far from liberating. From the very beginning, girls were not raised to be individuals. They were raised to be assets, not in the empowering "you're a queen" sense that gets tossed around on social media today, but more like you were a bargaining chip. Your body, your fertility, your obedience. They were all tools that would one day serve your father's interests through marriage alliances or dowries. You didn't get to dream about who you'd become. You got to learn how to weave, clean, cook, and maybe, if your family was rich, how to look pretty enough to catch the right kind of man. Education for girls wasn't totally off the table, but it was rare. Unless you were born into nobility or into a priestly family, your chances of learning to read and write were slim. You were more likely to be taught how to manage a household or preserve food than how to hold a pen or recite a myth. The most brutal part of it all, you were considered property, first of your father, then of your husband, and in a society where property could be traded, sold, or managed like livestock, that didn't exactly inspire confidence. Sure, Egyptian women had more legal rights on paper than their Greek or Roman counterparts centuries later. They could technically own land, run a business, or even file for divorce. But these rights existed more in theory than in practice. They didn't protect you from the everyday reality of being controlled. Laws may have existed, but culture has always had a way of making laws bend around male convenience. Your body wasn't your own. From the time you hit puberty, everything you did was scrutinized for its impact on your purity. And marriage value, a virginity wasn't just a virtue, it was currency. If you lost it outside of marriage, even through assault, it could ruin your life. There weren't trauma counselors or supportive systems to catch you. There was silence, shame, and exile, even when you were the victim. You had one job, to remain untouched until your father handed you off to your husband like a ceremonial gift. And speaking of husbands, love wasn't really part of the conversation. Marriage was about survival, family alliances, and reproduction. You didn't get to say no. You didn't get to wait for a connection or compatibility. Your consent wasn't required, because the idea of a woman having autonomy over her life choices was about as foreign to the ancient Egyptian world as space travel. Girls were expected to grow up fast. As young as 12 or 13, you could be married off and expected to run a household. If you died during childbirth, which was common, well, that was just part of the cycle. The state didn't mourn, the family moved on. Your only real value in this system came from how many sons you could produce. Daughters were a burden unless they were being groomed for marriage. If you gave birth to a string of girls, that was often seen as your personal failure, as though biology was your fault. Even play was different for girls. While boys were encouraged to explore, learn crafts, and shadow their fathers, girls were gently, or not so gently, nudged toward domestic roles. You learned to carry water, bake bread, care for younger siblings, and stay quiet. The phrase "seen but not heard" could have been engraved into your childhood like hieroglyphs on a temple wall. And while all of this sounds harsh, what made it worse was the illusion that things were equal. Modern people sometimes look at ancient Egypt and say, well, at least women had some rights. And it's true, they weren't completely invisible in society. They could inherit land, engage in contracts, or even serve as priestesses. But these exceptions were rare. For the average woman born into an average family, these rights might as well have been written on a scroll at the bottom of the Nile. There were no marches, no protests, no empowerment movements. There was silence, obedience, and quiet endurance. Women weren't encouraged to make history, they were expected to survive it. And if you dared to challenge that, to speak out, to reject your role, you risked everything, your reputation, your safety, even your life. So most didn't. Most adapted. Most accepted their fate with the kind of resigned grace that's often mistaken for contentment in dusty textbooks. So yes, ancient Egypt had pyramids, art, science, gods, and glamour. But for the average girl born under the blazing sun and the shadow of tradition, it wasn't golden or grand. It was rigid, restrictive, and ruled by expectations you never asked for. Being born female didn't mean you were powerless, but it meant you had to play the game very carefully just to survive. And all of that was just childhood. Marriage in ancient Egypt wasn't about love. It wasn't about chemistry or compatibility or romantic dinners by candlelight. It was a contract, a practical, often one-sided arrangement meant to secure family honor, produce children, and keep society orderly. And if you were a woman, it usually marked the moment your life stopped being your own. You didn't get a say in when it happened, who it happened with, or what kind of man would be sharing your bed. You were married when it was convenient for your father. Sometimes as early as 12, sometimes to a man decades older than you, sometimes to someone you'd never even spoken to. The moment you were of marriageable age, which in ancient terms meant old enough to bleed, you were shuffled from one man's household to another's, expected to instantly become wife, servant, cook, cleaner, and eventually mother. There were no wedding gowns, no rings, no dreamy ceremonies with friends cheering you on. A marriage in ancient Egypt was a transaction. Verbal, simple, and painfully matter of fact. A man might say, "She is my wife," and that was it. You were his. And with that one statement, your life could change forever. In some cases, women brought a dowry, goods or property contributed by the bride's family, a kind of thanks for taking her fee. It sounds absurd now, but back then it was standard. Your value as a wife was often judged by what you came with, whether it was land, livestock, household items, or simply a fertile body. From that day forward, you were expected to serve your husband, not in the cute Pinterest wife kind of way. In the keep his household running, stay quiet, stay loyal, and give him children a kind of way. The moment you became a wife, the pressure to become a mother hit fast and hard, and not just any mother, a mother of sons. Because while daughters might help around the house or be married off for alliances, sons were the ones who carried on the name, inherited land, and brought pride to a family. If you gave birth to daughters only, or worse, remained childless, you could be seen as cursed, defective, or punished by the gods. Infertility wasn't viewed as a medical issue. It was your personal failing. And if the man didn't want to deal with it, he could just take another wife or a concubine, no questions asked. You had no such luxury. Sex wasn't about pleasure. Not for you, at least. It was about duty. Your body was not your own, and once married, you were expected to be sexually available to your husband whenever he wanted. Consent wasn't even a concept. You existed for his satisfaction and the continuation of the family line. And if your husband died, you might be married off again, maybe to his brother, maybe to another man chosen by your father or male relatives, because heaven forbid a woman live on her own. Even in a happy marriage, freedom was limited. You couldn't just leave the house when you wanted. You couldn't travel, work freely, or socialize without someone keeping tabs. Your reputation was everything, and it took very little for gossip to ruin your name. A glance at the wrong man, a rumor whispered by jealous neighbors, a moment of defiance, and suddenly you were the immoral one, the dishonorable one, the woman who couldn't be trusted. And in a world where honor was everything, that kind of stain never fully washed out. Divorce did exist, but it was far easier for a man than a woman. If a husband wanted to end the marriage, he could. If you wanted to leave, good luck. You had to prove abuse, neglect, or betrayal, which meant risking everything by speaking up in a male-dominated society that didn't exactly rush to protect its women. Even if you succeeded, your status dropped, and unless your family was wealthy or influential, you could find yourself abandoned. No home, no support, and little hope of remarriage. You were no longer a daughter, no longer a wife, just a woman on her own, and in ancient Egypt, that meant vulnerability. Domestic life wasn't easier. You were responsible for keeping the household functioning, often without help. Cooking, cleaning, weaving, hauling water, raising children, these tasks consumed your day, and if your husband had other wives or concubines, that brought a whole new level of tension. Rivalry among women in the same household was common. You weren't just managing a home, you were navigating a minefield of jealousy, power struggles, and emotional survival, and heaven forbid you outshine your husband. Women were expected to be intelligent enough to run a household, but not so bold or clever that they overshadowed their men. You had to walk a tightrope, be capable but not threatening, loyal but not outspoken, attractive but not inviting. You had to exist within a narrow set of rules that could shift without warning. And if your husband decided you'd stepped out of line, he could cast you out, punish you, or worse, with very little societal pushback. So while historians like to say that Egyptian women had more rights than their counterparts in Greece or Mesopotamia, that statement doesn't mean what people think it means. Yes, there were laws that said you could inherit land, run a business, or own property. But these laws didn't shield you from the culture of male dominance. They didn't protect you from being married off like cattle. They didn't stop the emotional labor, the pressure to give birth, the fear of being replaced or discarded. Being married in ancient Egypt wasn't a fairy tale, it was often a trap, a slow erosion of self. A lifelong performance of duty wrapped in the illusion of stability. You were expected to endure, to survive, and to stay silent. And if you did all that without complaint, you were considered a good wife. A successful woman, a quiet triumph, but you never really got to live. Life inside the ancient Egyptian home was a quiet kind of prison, decorated with clay pots, warmed by the desert sun, and held together by expectations. If you were a woman, this was your kingdom, but not in the way it sounds. You weren't ruling anything. You were managing, maintaining, serving. The domestic sphere was where you were expected to disappear out of public life, out of politics, out of power, and into a space where your worth was measured by how well you kept the floor clean, the children fed, and your mouth shut. From the moment your marriage began, your days followed a predictable, repetitive rhythm. Wake up before the sun, tend to the fire, grind grain into flour by hand, an exhausting task that could take hours. Bake the bread, fetch water, sometimes walking long distances carrying heavy jugs, feed the children, wash the linens, sweep the floors, spin thread, mend clothes, prepare the next meal, and then do it all again. Every single day there was no end to the labor, no weekends to rest, no holidays where you kicked your feet up. The domestic work never stopped, and it was expected to be done with quiet, tireless devotion. And it wasn't just physical labor. It was emotional labor too. You had to keep the peace. You had to know when your husband was in a bad mood and steer clear. You had to manage the children's behavior, tend to the needs of in-laws, and sometimes even share your home with co-wives or concubines, each one with their own silent rivalry that simmered just below the surface. Your role wasn't just about doing things. It was about being something. You had to be agreeable, calm, nurturing, and endlessly patient. You had to avoid making a scene, avoid raising your voice, avoid giving any impression that you were unhappy or unsatisfied. Your emotions were not your own. If you were sad, you kept it to yourself. If you were angry, you swallowed it. There was no outlet, no therapist, no one asking if you were okay. You were expected to be the emotional glue of the household, holding everything together while quietly falling apart inside. And even if you did everything right, kept the home spotless, kept the children alive, kept your husband satisfied, there was still no guarantee of love, loyalty, or even basic respect. Your husband could take other women, could stay away for days, could speak down to you, and no one would blink. That was normal. That was accepted. You were not supposed to question it. If you did, you were the problem. A woman who was difficult, disobedient, ungrateful. These were the labels given to women who dared to push back against the role assigned to them. The culture didn't reward resistance. It punished it swiftly and silently. Privacy was a luxury you didn't have. Homes were small, often shared with extended family. You didn't have your own room, your own space, your own time. Even your body didn't fully belong to you. Whether it was for childbearing or sex or labor, your body was seen as a tool for someone else's benefit. And with childbirth being one of the most dangerous experiences a woman could go through, every pregnancy carried real risk. Women often died in childbirth, and those who survived were expected to go right back to work, tending to their other children, running the household, and preparing for the next baby. Child-rearing was not romanticized. It was survival. Children often died young. Disease, malnutrition, and accidents were common. You learned quickly not to get too attached too fast, and if your child died, you were still expected to function. Life didn't pause for your grief. The grains still had to be ground. The meals still had to be cooked. Your husband still expected things to be done. And let's not forget, being in the home didn't mean safety. Domestic abuse was not recognized in any formal way. If your husband hit you, it was considered a private matter. Your word carried less weight than his. There were no laws, no justice, no shelter to run to. Your suffering was invisible, dismissed as part of the natural order of things. After all, you were just a woman. You were supposed to endure. That's what made you strong. That's what made you virtuous. Some women, particularly those in wealthy households, had servants or slaves to help. But that didn't mean freedom. It just meant different responsibilities, managing people instead of doing all the labor yourself. You were still confined, still watched, still expected to perform a role, never step outside of it. If you were from the lower class, you worked even harder. You might have to contribute to your husband's trade, or farm the land, or sell goods at the market asterisk on top asterisk of all your domestic duties. Your workload was heavier, but your voice was still just as small. And yet, despite all of this, women survived. They adapted. They found ways to protect themselves, to form quiet alliances with other women, to find moments of laughter, pride, and even power within the limits they were given. But make no mistake, it wasn't liberation, it wasn't equality, it was survival under pressure, a slow, relentless suppression of self that began in girlhood and continued until death. People today look at ancient temples and see the grandeur, the beauty, the timelessness. But if you walked into one of those modest homes tucked away from the public eye, you'd see something different. You'd see women working themselves to the bone, hiding their pain, raising children who might not live to see adulthood, and bowing their heads so they could make it through another day. That was domestic life for women in ancient Egypt. Not glamorous, not empowered, just quiet endurance wrapped in the illusion of purpose. And the saddest part, they were told this was all they were made for, and many believed it. In ancient Egypt, goddesses were everywhere. Isis, Hathor, Sekhmet, Bastet. The temples were filled with their images, their statues, their stories. They were worshipped, revered, feared, and prayed to for everything from fertility to protection to healing. On the surface, it looked like a culture that deeply respected the feminine. You'd think that in a society where powerful female deities were central to religion, real women would have shared in that power. But the truth was far more ironic and bitter. The gap between how goddesses were treated and how real women lived was vast, and in many ways insulting. Because while these divine figures were adored, the women living in their shadows were still expected to stay silent, obedient, and small. Isis, for example, was known as the goddess of magic and motherhood. She was celebrated for her wisdom, her loyalty to her husband Osiris, and her strength in raising her son Horus alone after Osiris's murder. She was seen as the ideal woman, nurturing, faithful, powerful in her quiet suffering. But real women weren't allowed to be powerful in that way. They were allowed to be loyal, yes. They were encouraged to be nurturing. But any strength beyond that, any rebellion, any challenge to male authority, was dangerous. The strength that made Isis divine was punished in mortal women. If you tried to assert yourself, your voice was ignored. If you tried to lead, you were labeled unnatural. There was no space in the real world for women to embody the goddesses they were told to worship. Hathor was another revered figure, goddess of love, beauty, music, dance, and joy. She represented femininity in all its expressive forms, but again, only in myth. In reality, if you were a woman who showed too much sensuality, too much joy, too much boldness, you were watched, judged, labeled as promiscuous or immoral. Real women weren't allowed to dance freely in the streets or express their sexuality without consequences. Everything about a woman's body was tightly controlled. Even the clothes she wore were dictated by what was appropriate. For her status and marital position, you could praise Hathor, paint her on your walls, and name your daughter after her, but living like her, that was out of the question. It was all symbolism, not substance. Worshipping a female goddess didn't translate into respecting real women. These divine figures were idealized versions of femininity, perfect, pure, controlled, immortal. They were tools used by the male-dominated religious class to keep balance in the cosmos, not to challenge the earthly order. Their existence didn't disrupt the patriarchy. It reinforced it. Goddesses were not role models, they were myths. Stories crafted and preserved by men to shape what women should be, not what they could be. Even when women were allowed to become priestesses or take part in religious rituals, it was within strict boundaries. They served roles that were supportive, not dominant. They were caretakers of the sacred, not creators of doctrine. A woman might be granted the title of God's wife of Ammon, a powerful religious position, but that was usually reserved for royal women, untouchable, symbolic, distant from the realities of common life. The average woman wasn't stepping into a temple to lead prayers or shape theology. She was bringing offerings, lighting incense, asking for help from goddesses who looked like her, but who lived in a world she'd never reach. It's almost cruel how these myths painted such beautiful, powerful images of women, while everyday women lived restricted lives. Imagine being a girl growing up hearing stories of Isis's strength, of Bastet's ferocity, of Sekhmet's divine rage, only to be told later that your role in life is to be sweet, silent, and small. You could look up to these goddesses, but never become them. You could light candles in their names, but never act like them. You were human, and in the human world you had a place. That place was under the authority of men. Some might argue that the presence of goddesses proved women were seen as spiritually important. But being spiritually symbolic is not the same as being valued. It's easy to revere a figure when she doesn't challenge the social order. The goddesses were safe. They didn't demand rights. They didn't walk into town meetings and question the laws. They didn't protest arranged marriages or demand reproductive autonomy. They didn't live and bleed and suffer like real women did. Their perfection was their prison, and by holding them up as ideals, society created impossible standards that no living woman could ever meet. It's not unlike the way women today are bombarded with filtered, flawless images on screens, told they should be strong but soft, smart but not intimidating, beautiful but modest. Ancient Egyptian women were just dealing with a different version of the same hypocrisy. They were surrounded by murals and statues of divine femininity while being denied basic autonomy in their daily lives. And so the goddesses remained in the temples, painted on walls, carved into stone, sung about in hymns. Untouchable, untarnished, silent, while the women who worshipped them lived lives full of noise, burden, compromise, and quiet heartbreak. They prayed for fertility, for safety in childbirth, for peace in their homes. But they knew deep down that the world didn't see them as divine. It saw them as duty, bound, functional, replaceable, In the end, the goddesses may have given women something to believe in, something bigger than themselves, something that whispered of hidden power. But belief is not the same as liberation, and worship is not the same as equality. The temples could be filled with female statues, but the streets and homes of Egypt told a different story. One where real women walked in the shadows of myths, dreaming of lives they were never truly allowed to live. Death was supposed to be the great equalizer in ancient Egypt, the final journey where souls were weighed, judged, and sent into the afterlife to live in peace among the gods. The rich were buried with golden amulets and food offerings. Tombs were inscribed with prayers and rituals meant to guide the spirit safely through the underworld. But even in death, women couldn't escape the roles that society had imposed on them since birth. If you were a woman in ancient Egypt, your legacy wasn't really your own. It was filtered through the men who survived you. Your name might be remembered, but only if someone else chose to speak it. Your story might be told, but only if it served someone else's lineage. You lived in the margins of history, and that's exactly where you were often buried. Most women didn't get elaborate tombs or grand monuments. Those were reserved for kings, nobles, and high priests, nearly all men. If you were an ordinary woman, your final resting place was likely humble, simple, and unmarked. Your burial depended on your husband or male relatives to arrange it. If they were poor or simply unwilling, you might be buried without ceremony, without offerings, and without much care for your spirit's journey. And since women were often seen through the lens of their relationships, wife of, mother of, daughter of, your individual identity could easily vanish. If your name wasn't carved into a stela or preserved on papyrus, it was gone, erased, and in Egyptian belief, to be forgotten was a second kind of death, one that ended not just your life, but your place in eternity. Even when women were remembered, their stories were often edited to fit male narratives. A woman might be praised for being a loyal wife or a nurturing mother, but rarely for her intellect, creativity, or independence. Tomb inscriptions emphasized obedience and virtue, not ambition or individuality. The things women were praised for in death were the same things they were expected to perform in life: silence, service, submission. Even in the afterlife, your value was measured by how well you conformed, and if a woman did manage to rise to power, if she became a queen, a high priestess, or even a ruler like Hatshepsut, her legacy was often attacked after her death. Statues defaced, names chiseled out, histories rewritten. Male successors felt threatened by powerful women even long after they were gone. It was safer for them to pretend she hadn't existed than to admit she had once ruled. Hatshepsut, one of the most successful pharaohs of all time, had her images destroyed, her name scraped off monuments, her legacy buried under that of the men who followed her. If even a pharaoh could be erased, what chance did an ordinary woman have? The religious rituals surrounding death were also unequal. Men were believed to transition more easily into the afterlife, with more detailed spells and protections crafted in their favor. For women, many of the funerary texts had to be adjusted. Even the gods themselves were often male, and so the journey to the afterlife became another space where women were at a disadvantage. Inscriptions sometimes had to refer to female souls in male terms, just to fit them into the established belief system. The divine system wasn't built for women. It made space for them only when it had to, and only by bending the rules. Art from tombs shows women as passive companions, sitting behind their husbands, offering food, playing music. Rarely are they shown leading rituals or standing alone as powerful figures. They are painted smaller than the men, faces turned toward them in deference, and this wasn't just aesthetic. It reflected how society wanted to remember them. Even in symbolic death, a woman's place was beside a man, never in front of him. Legacy in ancient Egypt was about who remembered you, who honored you, and who carried your name forward, and for most women, that depended entirely on men. If your sons remembered you, your name lived on. If they didn't, or if you had no sons, your name faded. You could be buried with all the proper rituals, but if no one spoke your name, made offerings in your memory, or told your story, then your spirit could be lost forever. Women's legacies were fragile things, easily broken, easily forgotten. It's telling that we know so little about ordinary women in ancient Egypt. Their voices are almost completely missing from the historical record. We have their jewelry, their household tools, their mummies, but not their words. Their lives are seen through the accounts of men, drawn on tomb walls, mentioned in passing in official records. Their thoughts, struggles, dreams, all of it vanished. Not because they had nothing to say, but because no one bothered to record it. And that silence stretches across centuries, turning millions of lives into footnotes. But despite all of this, women still mattered. They raised the next generation. They kept households functioning. They were the quiet strength behind every family, every farm, every trade. They sang lullabies, brewed beer, planted gardens, stitched clothes, and held communities together. They were the ones who made life possible in a harsh and unforgiving world. And though history may not have written their stories in ink or carved them in stone, they existed. Their lives mattered. Their losses mattered. Their resilience, buried under centuries of sand and silence, still echoes faintly through the fragments left behind. In the end, women in ancient Egypt didn't die the way men did. Their deaths weren't remembered with great inscriptions or towering monuments. They slipped quietly into the earth, often unnoticed, often unnamed. But if we look closer, if we read between the lines of history, we can begin to hear their presence, not loud, not celebrated, but real. Always real.